Hello everybody, it's Train King James here, and we officially have reached the end of the model series of Thomas and Friends. We have watched 12 seasons here on this channel, and now it's time we gotta look at the 12th season, the final one, where we go from models to a hybrid, and eventually, next season, we'll begin with full CGI. So, this is kind of the end of an era, but is it a good end of the era? Well, let's get into the episodes, and I'll give my thoughts on the season at the end. Anyway, first episode, we have Thomas and the Billboard. I'm going to put it in B tier. It's a okay episode. I do kind of like the first episode of this new hybrid format of CGI face with model bodies. It starts off with an episode that features a lot of the Steam Team. It's kind of a rivalry between Thomas and Diesel. It's a fine episode. It's nothing special. There's things to like about it, but not a ton. It's perfectly fine. I think it's a decent season starter. Then we have Steady Eddie. I don't like this episode. I don't understand why Edward is the lead of this episode. He's completely out of character. The only reason why I don't have it in F tier is simply because I do like the chase sequence at the end, but this episode just does not fit his character. I don't know why Edward's wanting to show off a water wheel. Like, that's just not a thing he does. He's not a show-off. Like, why is this his episode? This is the final episode where Edward is the prominent character in the model series. And this is the one they gave him. Like, they just don't understand character, and it bothers me. But, nonetheless, here we are. And, yeah, some of the set design in this episode, there's a scene where, like, Edward passes a lumberyard, where Gordon's in the background, and it's just, the set design there looks bad, and it's a common trend in this season, and we'll talk more about it at the end, but I just wanted to bring it up. Then we get, Rosie's Funfair Special, which is almost a B tier episode, but I'm putting it in C tier because I do think the story is rather boring, and it's repetitive. It's a very typical engine has, screws up, important job, and it happens again. I do like, though, that it stars Rosie and not someone of the Steam Team, and I like that they do pair her and Emily together. It's a nice idea. It's just a shame that this episode has some other problems that Season 12 has. It also has the issue where it starts really in Steady Eddie, but it's not a huge part of the episode, where Season 12 had this thing where they wanted to bring back a bunch of characters. It's like their final ride, their final time of being seen on screen. So a lot of the models of the show do show up, a lot of characters show up, and most of them have very little impact to the episodes. They're just there to be like, hey, remember me? And this episode has Stepney in it. And he has a truck of sugar crash into him, and that's all his role is. Which, that's kind of upsetting. So, this episode has that. Steady Eddie had it with Oliver and Arthur, and plenty other episodes this season do it. So, I'm just not a huge fan of it, and I'll bring it up if there's like an egregious example of it. Then we have Mountain Marvel, an episode that I think is actually a pretty solid one. It's Peter Sam's first episode since Season 9 that he's the main character of. I also think it's a pretty nice episode about him and Proteus again. Him really being into the stories of Proteus now compared to the last time where he was very much a cynic is a nice growth in character. It's a fine episode. It's not the best of the season. Probably one of the better narrow gauge ones in all honesty. But yeah, it's a pretty good episode. Then we get Henry Gets It Wrong, and there's aspects of this episode I like the aspects of Henry being a tree hugger kind of character here, but I do think that the episode itself is still a little too silly for Henry, so that's why I put it in C tier. It's okay, it's not the worst episode, but it's also not very exciting, so just kind of one of those, boring, middling plots that Season 12 is loaded with. Heave Ho Thomas, though, was an episode I did find myself enjoying. I kind of like the one-sided Thomas and Hank rivalry. It kind of makes sense why Thomas is intimidated. I think it's a fun episode. I do think the 3 strikes in this episode do kind of build tension more than it's just like, oh, here's 3 dumb mistakes that Thomas did today. And I like that it kind of builds upon itself. it's like, okay, Thomas is straining himself more and more, so this is obviously going to end badly. And it does, but I do like that it doesn't happen, like, right away, very obviously. While Hank doesn't have the most character to him, I do kind of like I like his role in this episode, so not the worst idea. Anyway, moving on. Toby's Special Surprise is an episode I wanted to like more than I actually do, and it's really simply because this episode it sets the groundwork for something that could be really cool, and it does absolutely nothing with. And I kind of will talk about it more with another episode this season, but this episode in of itself is just a very bland, mid kind of episode. Excellent Emily is a really interesting episode this season because we actually get to pair Emily with Murdoch, a character who hasn't really been the main character of an episode since season 7, so it's nice to see the two of them work off each other. I do think Emily's a little too standoffish in this episode, but other than that, I do think that she's represented fairly well. And I think it's a pretty solid episode. One of the better ones this season. Just not quite as good as Heave-Ho Thomas. This episode also features the return of Duck. So we get to see him back very briefly. And Duck kind of falls in that same problem that, Stepney and some of the other characters this season have, where they all randomly appear. But at least Duck was used a few times. And he was used a few times in the season, so he did something. He didn't do a lot, but he did stuff. The Party Surprise. Not a really interesting episode, in my opinion. Colin's not really that interesting of a character. It's just simply okay. It's fine-ish. It's just a bland episode about Freddie and Colin. Not really all that interesting. It's very repetitive, down to the music, so I'm just not interested. The narration is also weird, and that's another problem this season, but we'll talk about that at the end, about my true thoughts about the season. But, yeah. Moving on. If you guys remember my How I Fixed the Hit Era video, you would know I'm not a huge fan of this episode. On this rewatch, the episode did rank slightly higher than I remember. It wasn't even the worst of the season. But it's still not a very good episode. I think Thomas gets a lot of blame for at least trying to be earnest and trying to do the right thing. And I do think the situations are a little dumb. And again, there is a sequence, and I'm going to go into this more towards the end. There's a sequence where Thomas comes across a tree that's blocking one track of a 3-lane main line. Then Thomas reverses back to a junction, which is 2-tracked, which is the junction before the tree. And then we see Harvey get switched off the line that isn't anywhere near that junction. I don't know how, and he's sent away. Who's supposed to clear the tree, a tree that is very barely blocking one track of a 3-track main line. And it just feels, it's lazy, and I'll explain why it's lazy more towards the end. Ironically, this was kind of an interesting episode, because I got to watch this episode on my birthday, an episode about the Thing Controller's children celebrating their birthday. But this episode isn't very good. It's Duncan in the hot air balloon. This episode doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Duncan has to deliver a hot air balloon, fine. But the hot air balloon is already inflated. Why? I don't know. It just is. And yet, Duncan is transporting it, and he's upset because the balloon takes away from his, special, the special ride he gives Mr. Percival's twins on their birthday. So, it wasn't a very well thought out episode. I mean, we've done episodes with balloons before and engines traveling with them. I don't know, it's just a dumb episode, so it goes in D tier. It was not D for dumb, it was not a fun one. Then we get James Works It Out, which is, I think, the best episode of the season, in my opinion. I like James and Hector's dynamic, and this is kind of more of what I want. I want to see characters interacting off of each other that probably won't in the next few seasons. If you get a really good episode about Hector working off of James, we get to see the trucks. We see more of Stanley from The Great Discovery. He doesn't do much. Typical. Yeah, I think it's one of the stronger episodes of the season. It's definitely my personal favorite. Then we get Tram Trouble, which this is an episode paired with Toby's special surprise that if the two of these episodes were about something a little bit stronger and actually were tied together, this could have been something really interesting. Imagine the Sodor Tramways board that Toby found, revealed it, and was like, oh yeah, these old trams were on it, and the tram was of Flora, and we discovered Flora in another episode, and maybe she and Toby have some sort of dynamic, maybe even a rivalry, where Toby for the longest time thought like he was the only steam tram on Sodor, and then here comes Florida. And it's like that could have been something really interesting for their characters. Instead, it's just, oh yeah, here's a steam tram named Flora. Nothing interesting about that. So, it's whatever. It could have been more interesting, but it isn't. So, these episodes, mid, C tier, it's where they belong. Don't Go Back, I think, is another example of just a very dumb episode. It's just Thomas and Diesel racing around the quarry, wrecking things and causing accidents because they're reckless. And they're just ignoring the fact that they're causing accidents, and it's just weird. And they don't really learn anything from the episode, honestly. Or at least Diesel doesn't, but again, what do you expect? It's just kind of boring and repetitive. Gordon takes a shortcut in an episode that kind of frustrates me, because there's a lot of cool elements in it, like a lot of characters do appear, but again, I think it's the epitome of the issue of these random characters appearing for the sake of, hey, we need characters to appear again. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I'm not a huge fan of episodes about characters going on shortcuts and whatnot, because it just ignores the concept of continuity and map and all that, and really how railways function in general, so this episode is just kind of dumb. And, yeah, I don't know. There's this weird sequence, right, where Gordon causes logs to roll down a hill, and he has to warn Stanley, and we know Stanley's fairly close. And then Gordon has to wait for the line to be cleared for him, and then he's lost, and he has to take all these different tracks to get down there. And a distance of time that probably would have taken Gordon, like, 30-plus minutes. And based on the fact that Stanley's whistle was heard, he could not be more than 5 minutes away. Like, that engine was 100% going to careen into it. But I digress, it's whatever. Just more lazy hit error stuff. Then we get The Man in the Hills, which is an episode I almost want to put in D tier, but I'm putting it in C tier. It's a really dumb episode for Thomas. I mean, he just goes around kidnapping people because he thinks they're the Man of the Hills, and he doesn't even take them back where he got them. He just takes them around, whatnot, to the wharf, and it's just, again, not much really to say about it. Nothing really all that interesting. First episode for F tier this season is Thomas Puts the Brakes On, because I think, again, this is just another dumb episode, but I think it doesn't make sense. This episode highlights the idea that this load of bricks that Thomas has is very important. They cannot afford to lose any bricks. If they lose any bricks, they can't finish the bridge. And this is something that is highlighted. Thomas literally loses a pallet of bricks into the water. Gone. That's it. So they're short, and yet they manage to finish the bridge no problem. So, I don't know. The crash sequence is very weird, because Thomas's chain, for whatever reason, becomes the length of Thomas, and it causes the flatbed to smack into him. I don't know why they did that, because that makes absolutely no sense. Just really bad directioning on this scene, and I feel like this is not the first episode to do it this season. I talked about it with another one. And it's just a bad episode. We get Murdoch and Stanley appearing in this episode, but they don't really have strong bearing on the plot. Thomas also is just rude to Stanley for no reason. Like, this is after the Great Discovery. He and Thomas don't have beef. And Thomas just doesn't want Stanley's help because reasons. He just doesn't. There's not even a mention like he just wants to do the job himself. It's mostly he just doesn't, he's not interested in Stanley's help. So, yeah, it goes in F tier. And it's not going to be the only episode in F tier. As we move on to Percy the Bandstand, which I thought was a pretty enjoyable episode overall. It wasn't the best of the season. I do kind of like seeing Lady Hat kind of take point in an episode. Another example of, like, lesser characters getting to appear more. I do wish Lady Hat was a little bit more like Season 5 Lady Hat, because I think that really would have made a nice dynamic, but, you know, this is fine. It's a good episode. It's nice to see the pack again. But that's really about it. I can really say about it. Nothing too crazy. I'm going to put Push Me, Pull You in F tier. I don't think I have to explain to anybody why this episode's in F tier. It's legitimately the dumbest, worst episode. It probably is the worst episode of the model era, in my honest opinion. I mean, this episode has the same problem of, like, Rheneas and the roller coaster, but, like, magnified to, like, 10. So, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. It's a bad episode. Then we end the season on Best Friends, which is just perfectly in the middle. Just an average, bland episode about Thomas Percy's friendship. It just really doesn't do anything all that special. So, yeah, if you notice about Season 12, this was not a very good season. This was not a very good season at all. And I think it's probably the worst season I've watched so far. I would describe the season, honestly, as just underbaked. You know, I was very disappointed with a lot of the episodes. It just felt like the direction was weird in a lot of scenes. It felt rushed. The sets felt underdone. They felt lazy. It didn't feel like they used a lot of locations this year. It felt like they were more trying to just, hey, how can we, like, film this episode really quickly? My guess is production was rushed, so they had time to animate the faces, which is also probably why they had less episodes. But yeah, this was just not a good season. And, you know, I spent less time talking about it because, frankly, there just isn't much to say. This was not a very good season, and I was very disappointed with the way the hit era ended. And to be honest, if you look at it, there are as many bad episodes in D tier as there are in the good tier. The good tiers, in A and B. I didn't have a single episode in S tier this season. None. That just goes to show you what I honestly think of Season 12. And Season 12, in my opinion, going into this rewatch, I had a feeling that this would be one of my least favorite seasons, and it was. It was honestly in some ways worse than I remember. So, that just goes to show you. I mean, a lot of these episodes, I don't feel like a part of the reason why I went back to do this rewatch was I really wanted to rewatch episodes to see if my opinions changed. And to be honest, not many episodes my opinions change, you know. In this season, other seasons, yeah, I found myself liking episodes more in other categories, but this season just felt so underbaked. And you know what? It's going to get an underbaked review. I'm not going to give it high praise. So, with that, this is Train King James signing off. I will be back with more content and a tier list, of course. See you around, guys.